The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
You know, when we make an argument for what we should be like in the public square, it's because here's what Jesus is asking us to act like everywhere else.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Bill Haslam was a 2-term governor of Tennessee and a 2-term mayor of Knoxville. In a political climate marked by metastasizing outrage and division, he found success by finding common ground and by treating allies and opponents alike with decency and respect. Bill Haslam is the author of Faithful Presence, The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. Bill Haslam, I am so glad that you have made time to be on the Habit Podcast.
Well, thank you. I've been looking forward to the conversation. So it's a little different than my typical conversation throughout the day, I should say that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. So your book is called Faithful Presence. And now, remind me of the subtitle. I'm sorry.
The Promise and Peril of Faith in the Public Square.
Yeah. So tell me about this. Why did you choose the title Faithful Presence? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I sort of shamelessly stole the phrase from James Davison Hunter with his permission. I did ask him if that was okay. But this whole idea of really trying to communicate two things when it came to the public square. One, that presence matters, that this is not a time to retreat and say kind of a pox on both of their houses. I'm frustrated and exhausted with the whole argument. Yeah. And then the idea of if we're going to be present, what would it look like to be faithfully present? There's, believers in the public square are known for a lot of things, but I'm not certain we're known for the things that Scripture would tell us to be known for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talk at some length in this book about the idea that we need to think about our politics biblically rather than letting our politics shape our faith. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. I completely agree with that idea. My concern is that no Christian person admits to letting their politics shape their faith. We all think it's our faith that shapes the way we think about politics. So how do you break through? Or
I think like with everything else, there's some helpful questions to ask us, and that would be which causes us more anxious moments: the thought that we would lose our country the way we want it to be, or that we would lose our God. Mm-hmm. So you start with some kind of foundational questions. The thought of the question of, in this whole discussion, Am I treating people that disagree with me as created in the image of God? There's some questions I try to ask throughout the book that help us to sort through that. But I would freely admit that your basic premise is true. We all think we're doing it right and the other folks are doing it wrong. And I think the last thing I would do is I really try to do my best to use Scripture to back up my argument, to say, here's, when we make an argument for what we should be like in the public square, it's because here's what Jesus is asking us to act like everywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you make the point that there are the non-negotiables. There are non-negotiables about being a person of faith. As you said, you've already mentioned treating people like they're made in the image of God, these kinds of things. And then there are policies,
right?
Policy issues that are negotiable, right?
So let's take what you just said. Okay, Scripture is really clear. We're supposed to feed the poor. It's not really clear how we're supposed to do that. Are we supposed to do that through, church-related agencies? Is it? Are we supposed to design government programs to do that? Are we supposed to, give a man a fish or teach a man to fish? We don't get that kind of instruction, and I think that's why. And I'm going to botch the. I'm not even going to try the quote, but I'm going to botch even referring to the quote. But C.S. Lewis refers very specifically against having political parties that are seen as Christian political parties, because he said for that reason, there's just certain things that there's not a Christian position on. And if we try to say there is one, then we're leaving out those people of faith who have a different position on a non-biblically clear issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So this may be asking the same question a different way. Confirmation bias is such an important thing for writers to come to terms with, right? Both my own my own tendency to only pay attention to things that confirm what I already believe, and also the difficulty in breaking through to another person, breaking through their confirmation bias. The truth is, confirmation bias pays.
Yes.
If I want more clicks, more reads, more whatever, playing to the choir is a great way to do that, and it takes a certain amount of, or takes a great amount of something beyond, self-promotion or something beyond a desire to have more readers, more clicks, more money, more whatever, to even resist confirmation bias.
You nailed it in so many ways there. So, you start with, again, remember, I'm writing to folks particularly about the public square, the political arena, if you will. And it is nowhere is it more true than it is easy to go get a lot of attention and to get lots of clicks and likes by saying those things that a lot of people will agree with, and saying them very forcefully and saying them in a way that belittles the other side. You can go do that really easily all day long. But zero is accomplished, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just, the phrase I use all the time, I'd way rather make a difference than make a point. And it's really, really easy in today's world to go make a point and have a lot of people add exclamation points to your point, and nothing happens. So the question back to what you said is, how do we break through confirmation bias for the reader, and then how do we make certain for ourselves that we're not showing it? And I'll start with I think those were your two questions. I'll start with the personal piece of that. One of the interesting things about writing a book about something like this is it's a little like giving a sermon in a church or talking somewhere and then having to be around all the people that you gave the sermon to, because you find yourself constantly like, I'm not doing so well at that myself. And I decided when I wrote this book that I don't know how many other books I'll write. So I thought I'm going to do the audio version of it myself. And then, so when it came out, I thought, I'm kind of curious, what's that sound like? So, I tend to listen to books when I'm working out. So when I was exercising, I started listening to it. And there were times I thought, that's really good stuff. I should write that down. Not because I wrote it, just because I realized, like, I'm not doing that so well myself right now. And so, the point I get, I think most any writer would recognize, or any preacher or anything would recognize, like, it's a lot easier to say this than it is to do it, because I realize I'm that way. Like, when I watch the news, when I see something I like, I like it. And when I'm had a breakfast with somebody this morning and talking about education issues, and he's a high school principal, and he was singing my song, and I just found myself leaning into him and like, this is great. You really know your stuff. And I thought, well, you know your stuff because you think like I do, which is not that. So I think that's part of, like, constantly, I mean, the way you break through it, I think, for yourself is make certain you're being exposed to different opinions and thoughtful ones at that.
Yeah.
For the reader, and trying to convince folks of that, the best thing I knew to do was give several examples, personal examples of how confirmation bias affects me, and hope that somebody could identify with that, and then give some very practical steps of things that you could do to break through that, from listening to different news sources to having conversations with people that have a different view than you do. I tried to have some practical suggestions in there.
Yeah. One reason I was really interested in looking forward to having you on the show was that, for when it comes to persuasion, when I'm trying to write something persuasive, there's still a real gap between, sort of two things going on here. One is there's a gap between me and the reader, and I don't really know if I've persuaded anybody or not. And secondly, if as a writer, I do measure my success in terms of, how many readers I have, or how many clicks I get, or whatever, that's all, as you said, that's all about making a point and not about making a difference. And in your line of work as a politician, you haven't really had the option of doing persuasion in any sort of abstract sense, right? If you persuade, you see a kind of real world result, and if you fail to persuade, you see another real world result, in a way that for people who all their persuasion happens on paper, it's a very different thing for us.
Right.
That wasn't exactly a question, was it? But
I get where you're going. It's, I know a lot of your audience are folks who are real writers, instead of people like me who pretend to be one for a short period of time. But it's been, to be honest with you, it's been another eye opener. It's like everything else. You realize, you write a book and you think, oh, okay, well, I hope this will have some impact and persuade some people. And you realize, oh, somebody that wrote this self-help book is going to sell 100 times more copies than you do, or whatever it is, and you kind of, there's that sobering thought of, I'm not certain this is going to make much of a dent in the universe.
Yeah.
I think my answer to myself when I realized that, I'm not going to be climbing the bestsellers list anytime. I was going to say anytime soon, but I think just saying anytime period, is this idea of the hope is to be able to persuade some folks that to move where they stand, and to think of their political and public arena presence. And by the way, I'm not just writing this to people who run for office. This is to all of us, because I think we should all be engaged. Yeah. But to help move them toward a position that I think hopefully reflects a more biblical position in terms of how we act. Yeah. And, it's like everything. I mean, believe me, I was a mayor for 2 terms and a governor for 2 terms. And sometimes you walk away thinking that made a big difference. And sometimes you walk away thinking, it didn't. I think that's just part of our human existence. And I think the my only thought would be faithful in what you're called to do. The harvest isn't up to us.
Yeah. I loved something when you were mayor of Knoxville and you revitalized a downtown that was struggling. Some of your messaging, which I really love and felt really feels like it's relevant to the whole project of what all creativity does, is you said this is everybody's neighborhood, right? In a city, I mean, there's nothing unusual about Knoxville to say that the different neighborhoods feel very different from one another. You said we're going to create this square that's going to be everybody's neighborhood, not just,
right.
And I loved it. It felt like a great example of what you're saying here about bringing the larger truths to bear on our local worldly truths. The fact that you're saying we are going. That's an act of persuasion, right? To say this is everybody's neighborhood. I'm going to get everybody behind this by saying this is everybody's neighborhood. And by the way, I've been to this revitalized downtown in Knoxville, and I love it. It's a great place, and it feels like a place that brings people together. And I guess I'm trying to work out some kind of metaphor for this is what the right kind of civic-minded persuasion does.
I mean, the time when I became mayor in Knoxville, we really did have this history of, folks in East Knoxville thinking West Knoxville got all the good attention, and folks that lived in South Knoxville said, I never want to come across the river unless I have to. And we had built up this animosity and this chippiness, if you will. Uh-huh. And in the meantime, we have these great bones of a downtown, a great structure with a market square right in the middle of town. And it just kind of worked to say, why don't we put our hearts into revitalizing the heart of the city, and then we'll try to grow it out from there. And I think there's something about that most folks could easily get behind. And like I said, the mayor is kind of like the quarterback of the football team, gets more credit when things go well and blame when things go bad. The reality is there were some pioneers that had kind of stuck out their head before we ever got there and made, personal investments and risked their own capital and, and everything else to make it work. But I do think if you want to say a metaphor, whatever, it's this whole idea of find a heart of an issue that people can identify with and rally around. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, persuasion becomes a little easier.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing, if I could take a little aside about, you talked about persuasion, and it's, again, the folks who are your audience is why I think what they do is so important is, unfortunately, we've gotten to the world, the political world's gotten to the point where persuasion is not a goal at all anymore.
Yeah.
It's just more about, I'm going to try to rally my side. I mean, we're an evenly divided country. And so if it's evenly divided, there's two ways I can win. I can try to convince some folks that are in the middle to come to my side. Or I can just say, I'm going to double down on my side and get all of them so mad that they will, at the other side, that they'll go vote. And that's the second has become the MO of most political operatives today. And it's really too bad because we've lost this value. We've lost putting a value in persuading.
Mm-hmm. So from where I sit, it seems like it would be easier to convince a few people on the other side to. How is it that we lost this interest in finding common ground?
Well, because I think I don't wholly know the answer to the question, but I would surmise that what's happened is folks have looked around and said, well, that's one way. I can go try to persuade those people in the middle to find common ground. Or the numbers work better if I just go get all the folks on my side who should vote to go vote. Uh-huh. And to make certain the folks on my side go vote, the best way to do that is to get them really mad. Get them really mad by saying the other side are bad guys. Mm-hmm. Okay. So those are two I can't really do both of those at the same time. I can't persuade the middle and convince the entrenched on my side that the other side are bad guys. I can't do both of those at the same time. And most folks have decided in today's media world, it's a lot easier to go try to convince the people on my side because I can advertise directly to them that the other people are bad guys.
Yeah. You mentioned an interview you did on a cable news network that was really short because you were how'd it go? Basically, they were saying, so you pushed through this legislation, right? That must have been a big fight. And you're like, actually, we got along pretty well.
You summarized it pretty well. It was we were kind of changing the way our employee system worked in terms of who got hired and who got promoted, and similar things that happened in other states. And there had been big, fights and rallies and people showing up at the Capitol. And we'd kind of taken a different approach to try to work some things out on the front end. When we passed it, it got the attention of, a couple of the national cable shows. And so they asked if I'd go on to talk about how we did it. And when I came on and they said, what were the riots like at the Capitol? And so we really didn't have, once it became apparent that there was no sizzle there, they literally dropped it. It was like, okay.
So look at the time. We got to go. Yeah. I got a call once to be on one of those shows. I published a book about C.S. Lewis. And so I think it was sort of a War on Christmas special. I don't know, something like that. And they called me and said, hey, let's talk about how, if C.S. Lewis were alive today, he'd never get these books published. And I said, well, actually, he was in a pretty hostile environment as, himself. And, it wasn't, anyway, they didn't call me back. They said, hey, we're having trouble with getting the satellite link together. So this ain't going to work out. And so that was it.
The reality is in that world, outrage sells. Yeah. And it sells really well. And the business model is basically based on outrage. And so again, that's to the folks who are your listeners. I think part of our task is to break through and to try to relight the spark of persuasion, and why that matters. Instead of derision works very well in this world. Persuasion doesn't.
Yeah, it feels like there's not a lot of interest in reality, right? It instead of conforming myself to a reality that I didn't create, I'm doubling down on creating some reality. And the truth is, with words, you can create certain realities. You can't create ultimate reality. I can monkey with the status quo, perhaps.
Right, but I think the message for us in this is we're supposed to be people of the truth. Mm-hmm. That's what we're called to be. We're called to be people that speak love and truth at the same time. And it's interesting if you look at for a long time, what was kind of thought of as the secular left was the one that said there's no such thing as truth. Okay, there's everything. It's the relative. It's modernism, etc. Yeah. Now the far right is kind of equally guilty. Right, it's a world of alternative facts and if we just say it loud enough, then people should believe us. And I think within this world, we, like I said, of all people, should be clinging to the idea of true truth, and that I feel like that should be part of the purpose that we're driving toward.
Yeah, and I feel like believing in an ultimate truth, a true truth, as you said, does give me a little latitude in some because I believe in a truth that I didn't create myself. I've got some latitude in the way I deal with other people or the way that I talk about the things of the world.
Well, and that's a little bit one of the questions you asked me was, how do you? I can't remember. One of your first questions was, well, in a world like this where we're all, all of us think that our faith is determining our politics. None of us really think our politics is determining our faith. How do you say, well, where that's really happening? And again, that's part of where I think the reality of coming back to having an ultimate truth that you're anchored in, that's, in my opinion, that's based in Scripture, gives us a reference point that is missing for other people.
That is menacing, you said?
Missing.
Missing. I was trying to say, where's this conversation going?
Right? No, not missing.
Yeah, missing. Yeah.
I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is I from time to time teach classes at university campuses. Was teaching at Vanderbilt a year or so ago, and we got into this conversation about, is there such a thing that's of truth that's true, relative, regardless of circumstances. And one of the students that was arguing with me had a backpack that was filled with pins about certain rights, rights for this and rights for that. And I said, well, you believe in ultimate truth too? And she goes, well, why do you say that? I said, well, you're claiming that there's such a thing as a right that comes from anything beyond an existing government. Like there's a human right, there's a equal rights, etc. That idea has to come from somewhere. Like I said, that in all these discussions, I think, should give us an anchoring point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you're right when you say this. I remember when I went to when I was in graduate school, early '90s, and just it was feeling shocked at the sort of postmodern Jacques Derrida, the idea that just sort of the experiments in perfect relativism, which as you said doesn't ultimately work out very well. But some of those ideas that were so shocking back then, people's grandmothers are espousing these ideas now.
Yeah.
And well,
but I mean, that would be back to what you said, those ideas that were so shocking. That's back to, we referred to James Hunter earlier. That would be his point, is that, those ideas that you were talking about in graduate school philosophy class eventually make their way into culture.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of the reasons why what you do and the folks that you're speaking to do is so important, is ultimately, ideas do become reality. Mm-hmm. And, being out there and competing in the marketplace of ideas, I think is an important call today.
Yeah. You used a term which I've been very familiar with the idea. I've seen the idea play out many, many times. Didn't know the term mode of attribution asymmetry. Yeah. Some mighty big words. Why don't you explain those?
Those are $4 words. Motivation attribution asymmetry is how much one side thinks the other side's motives are not just wrong, or their stances are not just wrong, but they come from bad motives. In other words, I don't just disagree with you. I think you have a horrible motive for thinking the way you do. Mm-hmm. And the point I bring up in the book is that today, and this is actually 5 years ago, so we know it's gotten worse, motivation attribution asymmetry in the U.S. between Republicans and Democrats is greater than that between Israelis and Palestinians. So this, like I said, the other side are wrong and they're bad people. They're not just, they don't just have a different opinion than mine. They're bad people, is growing. And part of, like I said, is part of the reason I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question I've been wanting to ask a real politician. So I'm counting you as a real politician since you were my governor for 8 years.
That's not an oxymoron.
Do the professional politicians, do the politicos, is this mode of attribution asymmetry as true for politicians as they pretend, as it seems to be, or are they just sort of stirring up and benefiting from that tendency in the rest of us? Like, I remember my cousin told me about a time he was driving down the highway in California and saw in a convertible Cadillac, Ric Flair and whoever Ric Flair's enemy was in wrestling, and they were just buddies. They were just going down the road, and they were, the point being it's all show, their antagonism. How real is the antagonism among the professional class of politicians as real as it looks?
No, I do think it's, I don't know if I'd compare it to the WWE wrestling, but I'd say this: you have to remember that politics is an industry like everything else. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of folks who make their living off of that. And a lot of those folks figure out the best way to make their living. And if you ever get a political mail piece that's wanting you to contribute, and you actually read through the letter, most of them are horrible. They're, mm-hmm. what they're saying about the other side. Well, whoever's writing that may or may not believe anything close to that, whoever the political consultant was. But they know that that's how you raise money. And does Ric Flair and whoever his opponent, the political equivalent of that, do they really hate each other that much? The unfortunate reality is, in today's world, they probably don't even know each other, even if they're both in the United States Senate. In the old world, the people went to Washington and they actually spent time there and they got to know each other. And the bad part is maybe they weren't in their district as much, but their families moved to Washington. They knew each other. They socialized, et cetera. Today, that's probably not true. And in like a state legislature like the one that I worked with, because they put ethics rules in place that prohibit them from people taking them out to dinner, and there's some good reasons for all that. But some of the downsides, like before, I could take, if you're a lobbyist, you could take 5 people out to dinner. You can't do that anymore. And so as a result, those 5 people do something different, but they probably don't get to know each other. My point in all that is just most people in today's political world, they don't really know each other personally all that well. They don't know the other side because I need to spend my time either in my district raising money, or if I have time spending it with my family.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time together. So you nicely brought this, or bringing this thing in for a landing, because what you're talking about is the difference between the abstract and the concrete, right? If I can think of the other side as strictly an abstraction, right, then I can say whatever I want to about those people, and I can believe it. I mean, I'm liable to believe anything about people I don't know. Right. If you tell me that that people in Italy are mostly cannibals, and I've never met an Italian, I might believe you. Right. Maybe that was a bad example, but I appreciate this idea that and I think this is relevant to writers and just to human beings, that when we know people, it's hard to believe some of the horrible things that one side says about the other when you actually know people from the other side.
Well, one of the things, the practical things we did when we were in office is we would have small groups of legislators over to dinner. And we had a rule like, okay, you can't lobby your bill. You can't, we're not going to have a political discussion. We can talk about anything you want except the stuff we're dealing with at the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And so it was amazing to me over time how people changed. It's like, okay, well, I still think you're wrong. Mm-hmm. But now that I know, that, you're the product of a single, you were raised by a single mother just like I was, or whatever the circumstance is, there's a different thing. And the point I would drive to off of that is I still think in everything else, it's like everything else. If you get the relationships right, most things tend to work out from there.
Yeah, that's great. Always end these conversations with a question: who are the writers who make you want to write? And if you want to adjust that to who are the thinkers who make you want to, do your job better, make whatever adjustments you want to that question. But I'd love to hear who are the people that make you want to do what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty big universe there of folks. I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. I mean, I still read more stuff by Lewis even now. I haven't read, I wouldn't say everything he's written, but a lot of it, and I still read something and go, wow, that is really, really good.
Yeah.
So I mean, that would be a first name that comes to mind. Tim Keller is both a friend and a great thinker, and so I tend to read a lot of Tim, and particularly as it kind of relates to how do we effectively persuade in the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gained a lot from him. But you actually were nice to give me a heads up on that question. I should have really worked through it. I could probably keep going with a list of 20 or 30 names of people that, oh yeah, that's helpful. And one of the things that was hard for me about writing a book is I did find myself wanting to, oh yeah, well, so-and-so wrote about that. I'm gonna read that. And then for a while you have this pile of books that's taller than your head and go about getting to work. Yeah.
Right. It's extra research is a great way to procrastinate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Bill Haslam, this has been so fun. Thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for what you've done for this state. May your tribe increase.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate at least for 30 minutes being thought of as a real writer.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.